Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world without grocery stores, or refrigerators, or even the faintest hope of Uber Eats. A world where dinner was usually whatever you'd grown, stored, or foraged, and sometimes, that meant dinner was nothing at all. So get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe settle under the blanket, or whatever substitute you have nearby. And as we settle in, let's wander into the strangely steady rhythm of life during a medieval famine year. It wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There were no daily riots, no constant plagues of locusts sweeping across the horizon. But for the peasants who lived through it, famine meant a slow, grinding slide into hunger, and then into whatever makeshift survival strategies could keep them alive until the next harvest. Naturally, the elites, lords, abbots, kings, spent a good deal of time fretting about their own supplies first. But peasants? They had to get creative. And of course, creativity in this case usually meant misery, because there's only so many ways you can make bark soup palatable. Let's drift back to a typical English village in the early 14th century, because that's when one of Europe's nastiest famines struck. The Great Famine, as historians have politely titled it, lasted from 1315 to 1317. 3 years where the weather apparently decided to wage war on crops. It rained so much in northern Europe that fields turned into shallow ponds. Grain rotted before it could ripen. Livestock starved or drowned. And peasants, who already lived on the knife's edge of food security, slipped right over the edge. Now, peasants weren't completely helpless. These were people whose entire lives revolved around coaxing food from the land. They had tricks, none of them delicious, but tricks nonetheless. First, there were the reserves. After each harvest, peasants kept a store of grain. It might be in a granary if you were lucky, or just a raised wooden chest in your home. But grain didn't keep forever. It sprouted, it molded, it attracted rodents who thought of your winter wheat as their personal buffet. Still, in a famine year, you dug into those reserves and tried not to think about the mouse droppings. Bread, which was usually the cornerstone of the medieval diet, became the daily gamble. You could stretch wheat flour with rye, barley, oats, or whatever coarse grain hadn't rotted yet. If things got desperate, you mixed in beans, peas, or ground acorns. The flavor? Let's just say that even squirrels weren't impressed. And there's a wonderful medieval invention called famine bread. That's bread bulked up with literally anything vaguely edible, tree bark ground into powder, moss, sometimes straw. Because naturally, you want a nice, fibrous crunch with your already meager ration. Peasants also relied on what the land itself could still provide. Foraging became not just a summer hobby but a lifeline. Nettles, wild herbs, mushrooms, though the line between edible mushroom and last mushroom you ever eat was a bit blurry. In some regions, families boiled roots that had no business being in a soup pot. Things like burdock, dock leaves, or cattail roots. A famine turned everyone into an amateur botanist. And a lucky family was the one with someone who could actually tell hemlock from parsley. Meat, of course, was rare enough in normal years. In famine years, it almost vanished. Livestock had to be fed, and with grain in short supply, peasants couldn't spare the food. Sometimes a village might slaughter a cow or pig before it starved, dividing the meat among families. But more often, they simply watched animals wither away. Chickens fared slightly better, as they could forage for scraps, but eggs became fewer and smaller. Milk? Often watered down, sometimes with more water than milk. And so people turned to what we might generously call alternative proteins. Frogs, snails, even rats if things were bad enough. French records show starving peasants eating cats and dogs during the Great Famine. Not exactly your dream medieval feast, but hunger rarely left room for squeamishness. Another survival strategy was mobility. Families sometimes left their villages in search of better prospects, though this was usually a gamble. Picture trudging through mud-soaked roads, stomach growling, in hopes that another lord's manor might have more generous granaries. Sometimes they found charity, especially from monasteries, which were expected to feed the poor. Other times, they were sent packing, or worse, fined for daring to leave their land. Serfdom had a way of reminding you that even your hunger wasn't entirely your own. Speaking of monasteries, this was the one place in medieval society where famine could almost be described as organized. Monks kept larger reserves of grain. They had fish ponds, gardens, sometimes even vineyards. And charity, while limited, did exist. Monasteries often gave out bread to villagers. Not enough to fill stomachs, but just enough to keep people staggering along. Some towns had municipal granaries where emergency reserves were stored, though whether those actually made it to peasants rather than lining the tables of local elites is debatable. Of course, famine wasn't just about empty stomachs. Hunger had ripple effects. People grew weaker, illness spread faster, and work became harder. A peasant who could barely lift a hoe wasn't going to produce much in the next planting season. Malnutrition hit children especially hard, stunning growth and lowering survival odds. Chroniclers note that in these years, many children were given away, which sounds charitable until you realize it often meant abandoning them at monasteries, or simply leaving them in towns where begging might keep them alive. Marriage patterns shifted too. Fewer weddings took place during famine years, because who wanted the expense of feeding an extra family? Birth rates dropped. And yet, oddly enough, the church continued to scold peasants for not producing enough legitimate heirs. Priorities, as always, were carefully misaligned. Let's drift into the kitchens of those who were slightly better off, the village reeve, perhaps, or a small-scale landholder. Their tables weren't groaning with abundance either, but they had a bit more cushion. Salted meat tucked away in barrels. Cheese wheels that could last a few months. Honey as both sweetener and preservative. Their neighbors might beg, borrow, or steal from them, depending on desperation levels. And sometimes, a wealthier villager did indeed share. More often, they locked their storerooms and complained about theft. Because nothing says community spirit like keeping your cheese under guard. And then there were the lords. Safely nestled in their manors, they were rarely in danger of starving. Their kitchens might scale back the variety of dishes, but they still had bread, meat, and imported wine. Their main inconvenience was higher prices. To them, famine was mostly an accounting problem. How much more would they have to pay for grain, and how much could they squeeze out of their tenants before they themselves started rioting? That brings us to the less savory survival tactic, crime. Theft, naturally, increased. Grain stolen from fields. Sheep disappearing from pens. Records note groups of starving peasants raiding stores of flour, sometimes with violence. For authorities, this was deeply offensive, not because people were starving, but because the property rights of the wealthy were being inconvenienced. Punishments ranged from whipping to hanging, because nothing encourages agricultural recovery like killing off the labor force. Worse still, famine sometimes pushed people into cannibalism. Chroniclers of the Great Famine wrote of parents abandoning children, and of travelers found with suspiciously meaty stew pots. How much of this was exaggerated moralizing versus reality is debated. But given the sheer level of hunger, we can't entirely dismiss it. Now, famine didn't last forever. The rains eventually receded, and the harvests recovered. But the scars remained. Population levels dipped. Families carried debts for years, because in order to survive, they'd borrowed grain or money from landlords. Entire villages were sometimes abandoned, the inhabitants scattered or dead. And even after food returned, diets remained meager. Recovery was slow, uneven, and always overshadowed by the fear that the next bad harvest might bring the same misery all over again. And so, the daily rhythm of a famine year was one of constant negotiation. What to eat, how to stretch it, whether to risk leaving, who to beg from, who to steal from. Survival was rarely about heroics, it was about endurance. Small choices, day after day. Peasants grumbled, prayed, and chewed on whatever passed for bread. And if they were lucky, they saw the next harvest. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine yourself in that world. The damp air of a thatched cottage. The faint smell of mold clinging to a rough loaf. The sound of rain tapping against the shutters, knowing it might mean another spoiled field. And the quiet resilience of people who, somehow, found ways to keep going. Because in a famine year, survival wasn't glamorous. It wasn't noble. It was often deeply unpleasant. But it was, in its own way, steady. And with that, let's gently drift toward our next historical fiasco. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's shift our gaze from the muddy cottages of hungry peasants to something a bit more gilded. Tonight, we're floating into the life of a woman whose world was embroidered with fine silks, tangled dynastic claims, and an almost cartoonish level of political misfortune. Mary, Queen of Scots. Born in December of 1542, and executed in February of 1587. A life that stretched just 44 years, yet contained more plots, marriages, betrayals, and awkward family feuds than most royal dynasties manage in a century. She has been romanticized endlessly: tragic beauty, doomed queen, Catholic martyr. But if we look more closely, what we really find is a woman stuck at the center of dynastic whirlpools. A life where the accidents of birth, marriage, and religion stacked up into one long, exhausting cautionary tale. So let's get comfortable. Let's take this story slowly. And let's wander, gently, through Mary's life. Mary was born at Linlithgow Palace, in Scotland, on December 8, 1542. Her father, James V of Scotland, had been in poor health. And 6 days later, he was dead. That left Mary, tiny, barely out of the cradle, as Queen of Scotland. Which is never an ideal resume: infant, female, monarch. The Scots, to their credit, didn't immediately collapse into despair. They were used to turbulence. But still, raising an infant queen presented obvious problems. Who was going to govern? Who was going to marry her? And perhaps most importantly, how many foreign monarchs could they annoy by doing either badly? Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, a Frenchwoman from the powerful Guise family, stepped in to act as regent. Scotland, meanwhile, teetered between its two great influencers, Catholic France and Protestant England. And naturally, both decided Mary was their pawn of choice. Henry VIII of England, at this point in his career, was still alive and still busy arranging political marriages like a maniacal wedding planner with anger issues. He proposed that Mary should marry his son, the future Edward VI. This, he believed, would unite Scotland and England. And to encourage this arrangement, he launched a military campaign, which the Scots later nicknamed, quite cheerfully, the Rough Wooing. Because nothing says romance like burning villages and raiding monasteries. The Scots, unsurprisingly, declined this offer. Instead, Mary was betrothed to the French Dauphin, François, in a classic Franco-Scottish alliance. So at the age of 5, she was bundled off to France, never to see her mother again. And here's where her life takes its first sharp turn. She didn't grow up in dour, rain-soaked castles of Scotland. She grew up in the lavish French court. Imagine being raised among pearls, velvet gowns, perfumed gardens, witty courtiers, and a cuisine that didn't involve oats in every single meal. By all accounts, Mary flourished in France. She was tall for the era, nearly 6 feet, and striking, with auburn hair and a clear complexion. The French poets adored her. They called her La Reine Blanche, the White Queen, for her pale skin. She was clever, quick with words, fluent in French and Latin, with enough skill in music and poetry to impress even jaded courtiers. In 1558, at age 15, she married François, heir to the French throne. It looked like her future was set. Queen of Scotland, and soon to be Queen of France. Not a bad deal for a teenager. But life had other ideas. In 1559, François became King of France, making Mary both Queen Consort of France and Queen Regnant of Scotland. The dynastic jackpot. Except François was sickly. Very sickly. And after just 17 months on the throne, he died of an ear infection that spiraled out of control. He was 16. Mary was 18. And suddenly, her glittering life in France was over. The French no longer needed her. She was politely shoved aside while her mother-in-law, the formidable Catherine de' Medici, seized control of the young Charles IX's court. Mary had little choice. She packed up her gowns, her jewels, and her courtly education, and returned to Scotland in 1561. Now, let's pause here. Imagine being Mary at this moment. You've spent your entire adolescence in the polished French court. You speak French more fluently than Scots. You're accustomed to chivalric tournaments, elegant banquets, intellectual debates. And then you arrive in Edinburgh, which, in 1561, was, let's say, practical. Narrow, muddy streets. Stone houses packed tightly, with chamber pots being emptied out the windows. A noble class less concerned with poetry than with feuds, cattle, and stabbing their neighbors. Mary tried her best. She was still Catholic, but Scotland by now had experienced the Protestant Reformation. John Knox, the stern Calvinist preacher, was loudly condemning her mass and writing pamphlets about the dangers of that woman Jezebel. Mary, for her part, smiled politely, ignored him as best she could, and continued to attend Mass in her private chapel. And this is where her story starts to feel like an endless parade of poor marriage choices. First up, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was her cousin, tall, handsome, and, on paper, a good match. But he was also vain, arrogant, and enjoyed drinking more than governing. Mary married him in 1565, partly to strengthen her claim to the English throne, since both she and Darnley descended from Henry VII of England. It was, by most accounts, a disaster. Darnley quickly alienated the nobles with his swaggering behavior. He demanded to be made king, in title and power, not just as Mary's consort. Mary refused, and their marriage spiraled downward. The low point, or perhaps the high point, if you enjoy gallows humor, came in 1566. Mary was pregnant at the time. She was dining at Holyrood Palace with her secretary, David Rizzio, a close Italian friend. Suddenly, Darnley and a group of armed nobles burst in, dragged Rizzio into another room, and stabbed him more than 50 times. Right in front of Mary. Naturally, this did not improve the marriage. Mary gave birth to a son later that year, James, who would eventually become James VI of Scotland and, later, James I of England. But the marriage with Darnley was irretrievably broken. Darnley fled, sulked, begged, and made himself generally intolerable. Then, in February 1567, Darnley was found dead. His house had exploded, literally blown up. Yet oddly enough, his body was found in the garden, unburnt, but strangled, which suggested that someone had killed him before, or after, the blast. Either way, it was one of the least subtle assassinations in Scottish history. Suspicion naturally fell on Mary, though whether she was involved is still debated. But one man's name kept coming up, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, who, mere weeks later, married Mary. Because naturally, nothing clears your name of suspicion in your husband's murder like marrying the prime suspect. The Bothwell marriage was the true breaking point. Many nobles revolted. They accused Bothwell of kidnapping Mary, though how consensual or coerced the marriage remains unclear. But in the eyes of Scotland's lords, Mary had gone too far. In June 1567, at Carberry Hill, Mary surrendered. Bothwell fled into exile, where he eventually died raving in a Danish prison. Mary, meanwhile, was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James. She was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, a grey fortress on an island in the middle of a loch. There she stayed for nearly a year, until she managed to escape in 1568. She rallied some supporters, but was defeated at the Battle of Langside. And so she fled south, into England, to her cousin, Elizabeth I, which was, frankly, a mistake. Elizabeth was not thrilled. On the one hand, Mary was family. On the other hand, Mary had a very strong claim to Elizabeth's throne. Catholics in England saw Mary as the rightful queen, since they considered Elizabeth illegitimate. Having Mary in the country was like storing a lit torch in the middle of a hay barn. So Elizabeth did the only sensible thing. She locked Mary up. Not in a dungeon, of course. Mary spent her captivity moving from one stately home to another, Bolton Castle, Sheffield Castle, Tutbury Castle, and so on. Comfortable enough, but always under guard. And here's where Mary's life slowed into a long, frustrating stasis. 19 years of house arrest. She embroidered. She plotted. She wrote letters. She tried to charm her keepers. She became a focus for Catholic conspiracies. And Elizabeth's ministers grew more and more nervous. Eventually, in 1586, Mary was implicated in the Babington plot, a Catholic plan to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Letters, intercepted and decoded, showed Mary giving her approval. Whether she was truly enthusiastic or simply trapped into incriminating herself remains debated. But for Elizabeth's government, it was enough. In February 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She dressed carefully for the occasion, in crimson undergarments, the Catholic color of martyrdom. Accounts say she died bravely, though the executioner made a mess of it, needing 3 strokes to remove her head. Her little dog, they say, was found hiding under her skirts afterward. Which is probably the most human detail in the whole grim affair. And so ended the life of Mary, Queen of Scots. A woman born a queen, married to a king, mother of a king, and cousin to a queen. Yet most of her life was defined by miscalculation, imprisonment, and other people's ambitions. History has painted her in many colors: romantic heroine, Catholic martyr, foolish schemer. Perhaps she was all of these, or none. What's certain is that she lived at the fault line of dynasties, and when the ground shifted, she was the one who fell. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, perhaps picture her last years. Embroidering patiently in a cold castle chamber. Watching the seasons change through barred windows. Writing letters that might never reach their recipients. Waiting, always waiting, in the long twilight of captivity. Because sometimes, history's tragedies aren't a sudden downfall. They're 19 years of nothing. And with that, let's drift toward our next royal misadventure. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're staying in Scotland, though instead of queens and executions, we're looking at something far more practical. What people ate. Or, more precisely, what they managed to scrape together in the form of bread, porridge, and broth. Because medieval Scotland was not a land of lavish feasts. Unless you happened to be a lord or bishop, your daily menu wasn't going to impress anyone. It was simple, repetitive, sometimes nourishing, sometimes barely edible. But it kept you alive. Most of the time. So let's wander slowly into the kitchens and hearths of medieval Scotland. Let's stir the pot, sift the flour, and find out what really filled stomachs in those damp stone cottages. Bread, not quite the daily loaf. When we think of medieval food, bread looms large. But in Scotland, bread was never quite the universal staple it was in England or France. Wheat simply didn't thrive in Scotland's climate. It preferred warmer, drier fields. Scottish soil, meanwhile, produced barley and oats. Lots of barley and oats. So while English peasants might grumble about coarse rye bread, Scottish peasants were more likely eating flat barley bannocks or oatcakes. Think of a dense, dry pancake, cooked on a griddle or a heated stone by the fire. Easy to carry, easy to store, and hard enough to serve as a makeshift weapon if needed. Wheat bread existed, of course, but only for the wealthy. Imported from regions where wheat could grow, it was white, soft, and costly. To eat it was to make a statement: look at me, I have enough money to chew fluff instead of bark. The church, naturally, also preferred wheat bread for communion. Because why consecrate something humble when you could insist on luxury? Barley bread was more common, but it had its issues. Barley flour didn't rise well. The loaves were heavy, damp, and went stale almost immediately. In winter, peasants might dry the loaves rock hard and then soak them in broth to soften them. Which, admittedly, made them resemble a sponge that had been left in the sink too long. And then there were oats. Oats were the backbone of Scottish diets. Ground into meal, pressed into cakes, or simply boiled. Which leads us neatly to the national obsession. Porridge, the eternal meal. Oat porridge. Morning, noon, and night. Hot, if you were lucky. Cold and congealed, if you weren't. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, qualities that made it beloved, or at least tolerated. A medieval Scottish kitchen often had a pot simmering with some form of porridge. Oats boiled with water, perhaps with a splash of milk if a cow had been generous that day. Salt for flavor. That was the standard. Anything beyond that was a luxury. Children grew up on it, travelers carried hard oatcakes in their packs, and laborers ate it before heading to the fields. Even noble households served porridge, but theirs might be enriched with honey, butter, or dried fruit. Because naturally, if you're wealthy, you don't eat plain oats. You eat dessert disguised as oats. And there's an enduring stereotype about Scots carrying a little bag of oatmeal at all times. Which, oddly enough, has some truth. Soldiers, in particular, were known to carry meal that could be mixed with water to make instant porridge. The medieval equivalent of a protein bar, except with far more chewing involved. One can imagine a medieval Scot, squatting by a roadside fire, stirring his portable oats into a pot and thinking, well, at least it isn't English. Broth, a pot of possibilities. If porridge was the constant, broth was the improvisation. At its simplest, broth was just oats boiled with water until thick. Add in a few vegetables, a bone, some scraps of meat, maybe a pinch of herbs, and suddenly it became kale broth or chicken broth or, if you were especially lucky, beef broth. The base was usually barley or oats, thickened until it could almost hold a spoon upright. Into this went whatever the household could spare. Leeks, onions, kale, turnips. Sometimes nettles or other wild greens. If meat was added, it was usually the cheapest cuts, bones with little flesh, offal, or whatever hadn't spoiled yet. In noble households, broth became pottage, a thicker, richer stew with wine, spices, and generous chunks of meat. Recipes from aristocratic kitchens sometimes list 20 ingredients. In peasant huts, the recipe was simpler, everything you own in a pot. One charming feature of broth was that the pot never really emptied. Families would keep adding water, oats, and scraps day after day. It was less a meal than a permanent household ecosystem. A medieval sourdough starter, except it was soup. Feast versus famine. The contrasts, of course, were sharp. A noble might dine on trenchers of wheat bread, spiced beef broth, and creamy porridge sweetened with honey. A peasant, meanwhile, gnawed on an oatcake, slurped watery kale broth, and counted himself lucky if there was a sliver of salted fish floating in it. During lean times, things grew grim. Bread might be stretched with pea flour or even ground up tree bark. Porridge might be just oats and water, with no salt at all. Broth might contain nothing more than a few turnip tops and the memory of a chicken. And yet, these humble foods kept people alive. Oats, in particular, provided enough calories to sustain hard labor. Broth, when made with bones, gave valuable nutrients. And bread, however heavy, offered a sense of familiarity, a daily ritual of breaking and sharing. Kitchens and cooking. How were these foods made? In the simplest way possible. Most homes had a central hearth, with a pot hanging from an iron hook. That pot was rarely empty. In went the oats for porridge in the morning, then vegetables and broth in the evening. Flatbreads were cooked on a bakestone or griddle, laid directly over the fire. Flour was ground at communal mills, often under the control of the local lord. Peasants had to pay to use the mill, usually by giving the miller a portion of their grain. Which, naturally, led to endless complaints that millers were dishonest, taking far more than their due. And in fairness, they probably were. Bread, porridge, and broth weren't just food, they were social. Meals were eaten from shared dishes, with wooden spoons or by dipping bread into the pot. Individual plates were rare. Eating was communal, messy, and entirely practical. The flavor question. And what about taste? We have to be honest, medieval Scottish food was not a carnival of flavor. Salt was available, but expensive. Spices were reserved for the wealthy. Most peasants seasoned their meals with onions, leeks, or herbs like parsley and mint. Broth with kale and leeks might be pleasantly hearty. Fresh oatcakes could be nutty and crisp. But by and large, meals were repetitive. Oats one way or another, day after day. It was fuel, not fine dining. Still, there were bright spots. Honey provided sweetness. Berries could be foraged in summer. Fish, especially herring, was common along coasts and rivers. And in autumn, when animals were slaughtered before winter, there might be a brief glut of fresh meat. A fleeting festival of flavor before the return to oats. Symbolism and survival. It's worth remembering that food wasn't just sustenance, it carried symbolism. Bread had deep religious meaning. Porridge represented simplicity and endurance. Broth, bubbling endlessly at the hearth, was the warmth of the household itself. When famine struck, the absence of these foods was more than hunger, it was disorientation. To go without bread or porridge was to feel the world itself slipping out of balance. People prayed for their daily bread not as a metaphor, but because it was literally what stood between them and starvation. So as you drift off tonight, picture a Scottish cottage in the 14th century. The hearth glowing faintly. A pot simmering with broth, thick with oats and kale. A bannock cooling on a stone slab. The sound of rain against the roof, the smell of smoke clinging to the air. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't varied. But it was steady. And in the Middle Ages, that counted for a lot. Because bread, porridge, and broth weren't just meals. They were survival itself, ladled out one wooden spoon at a time. And with that, let's drift onward, to our next historical oddity. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're leaving the damp Scottish kitchens behind, and instead we're heading to the dusty, sun-baked hills of the Levant. Specifically, to the summer of 1099, when a ragtag coalition of European knights and foot soldiers finally reached their grand prize, the holy city of Jerusalem. This was the climax of the First Crusade. Years of marching, starving, arguing, and occasionally eating their horses had brought them to the gates of a city that shimmered in the desert light. And, naturally, they decided to lay siege to it. Because why settle for a peaceful pilgrimage when you can build siege towers in blistering heat? Let's drift into the details. Not the grand, trumpet-blaring versions of later chronicles, but the small, slow moments of a siege that lasted weeks and exhausted everyone involved. The road to Jerusalem. By 1099, the Crusaders had been on the move for nearly 3 years. They'd set out in 1096, full of piety, greed, or perhaps just boredom with northern European weather. Along the way, they'd suffered massacres, hunger, plagues, and more than one instance of disastrous leadership. Yet somehow, against most expectations, they had captured Antioch the year before. From there, the path led south. Through heat, thirst, and the occasional skirmish. When they finally caught sight of Jerusalem in early June, the chroniclers described the scene with awe. Pilgrims fell to their knees. Some wept. Others sang hymns. A few probably just sighed in relief that there was finally a city in sight and not another empty stretch of scrubland. The problem was simple: Jerusalem wasn't just going to let them in. The city was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate. Its walls were thick, its gates were reinforced, and its defenders had every reason to hold firm. The defenders. At this time, Jerusalem was held by a Fatimid governor named Iftikhar al-Dawla. He had a garrison, local militia, and the advantage of strong fortifications. He also had a city full of inhabitants, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, who had to endure the siege whether they wanted to or not. Iftikhar, sensibly, ordered wells outside the city poisoned or destroyed. The Crusaders arrived thirsty and found only brackish puddles. For an army already on the edge of starvation, this was not a good start. The Crusaders' situation. The Crusaders numbered perhaps 12,000 by this point, tiny compared to the vast hosts that had set out years before. Many had died or gone home. What remained was a hardened, stubborn core. Led by men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Tancred of Hauteville, they were united only by desperation and a shared desire to actually finish this campaign. They had very little food. No siege engines. Barely any horses left. And they were standing in the hot sun, looking at high stone walls. This was not, at first glance, a promising situation. And yet, they began. Because of course they did. First assaults. In June, they launched their first attempts at the walls. These were not effective. Without proper ladders, rams, or towers, the Crusaders could do little more than shout, throw stones, and hope. The defenders, meanwhile, rained down arrows, rocks, and the occasional boiling liquid. One chronicler describes Crusaders attempting to climb the walls with ladders, only for the defenders to push them back with poles. Imagine traveling 3,000 miles only to be poked off a ladder by a man with a stick. After a few days of this, it became clear they needed better equipment. So, naturally, they began scavenging. Building siege engines. Timber was scarce around Jerusalem. The hills were mostly scrubby, not forested. So the Crusaders had to bring in wood from a distance, carrying beams for miles. They built siege towers and battering rams under the blazing sun, while defenders shot arrows and tried to set everything on fire. And here's where the story takes a slightly miraculous turn. A Genoese fleet happened to arrive at the port of Jaffa, bringing supplies, craftsmen, and materials. Suddenly, the Crusaders had real equipment. Siege towers were constructed, creaking, towering wooden structures on wheels, designed to roll up to the walls and allow soldiers to storm over the top. The defenders, for their part, built countermeasures. They reinforced the walls with earth. They prepared pitch, oil, and torches to set the towers ablaze. The siege became a slow contest of carpentry, patience, and endurance. The procession. At one point, despair set in. The Crusaders were hungry, thirsty, and demoralized. So the leaders decided on a show of piety. They organized a procession around the city walls, barefoot, singing hymns, carrying relics. The defenders, watching from above, were not particularly impressed. But for the Crusaders, it was a moment of solidarity. A reminder of why they were there. According to some accounts, they were inspired by the story of Jericho, where walls fell after a procession and trumpets. Of course, Jerusalem's walls remained firmly upright. But morale, at least, improved. The final assault. By mid-July, the siege towers were ready. On July 14th, the Crusaders wheeled them into place. Godfrey of Bouillon took charge of one tower. Raymond of Toulouse commanded another. All day, they pushed the towers forward under a hail of arrows and fire. Defenders hurled torches, stones, and pots of flaming pitch. Crusaders doused their towers with vinegar and wet hides to keep them from burning. Slowly, inch by inch, the towers crept closer. On July 15th, the moment came. Godfrey's tower reached the northern wall, near the area later called Herod's Gate. A drawbridge crashed down. Crusaders surged across, fighting hand-to-hand on the ramparts. After brutal, chaotic combat, they broke through. One by one, gates were opened. Crusaders poured into the city. The defenders retreated or were cut down. By midday, Jerusalem had fallen. The aftermath. Now, we should acknowledge something. Chroniclers, especially Western ones, describe what followed as a massacre. Muslims and Jews within the city were killed in large numbers. Bloodshed was immense. Later writers, trying to glorify the Crusaders, even exaggerated the gore. But the reality, stripped of drama, was grim enough. The capture of a city rarely ended without violence. For the Crusaders, however, this was triumph. After years of hardship, they had taken Jerusalem. They prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They sang hymns. Some wept with joy, others with sheer exhaustion. Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of king, calling himself instead advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Which was a very pious way of saying, I'm in charge now. The First Crusade had achieved its improbable goal. Life in the city afterward. Of course, capturing a city is one thing. Governing it is another. The Crusaders now faced the task of ruling a land far from home, surrounded by hostile neighbors, dependent on supply lines across the Mediterranean. But that's a problem for another day. For the average Crusader, July 1099 marked the end of a pilgrimage. Some stayed, carving out fiefs in the new kingdom of Jerusalem. Others returned to Europe, bringing tales of glory, and perhaps a renewed appreciation for the relative abundance of food and water back home. A slow reflection. So what do we make of this siege, seen through the sleepy lens of history? On one level, it was the climax of a bloody campaign. On another, it was weeks of men hauling wood, sweating under the sun, building towers, and hoping they wouldn't collapse. The drama of conquest rests on a foundation of carpentry, logistics, and stubborn persistence. And if we picture it quietly, without trumpets or banners, it becomes something else: tired soldiers drinking foul water, craftsmen hammering beams together, defenders tossing stones from the battlements, and the long, tense silence of nights spent waiting for dawn. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 wasn't just a clash of civilizations, or a religious turning point. It was also the weary sigh of people who had come too far to turn back. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the city at twilight, its walls casting long shadows. A wooden tower groaning as it inches forward. The sound of distant hymns mixing with the cries of defenders. The smell of smoke in the air. And beyond it all, the quiet, endless desert. Because history, even at its loudest, is lived moment by moment. One tired footstep after another. And with that, let's move gently on, to our next tangle of dynasties and oddities. Hey everyone! Tonight we're picking up where we left off. The summer dust of Jerusalem has just begun to settle. The Crusaders, tired and sunburned, have finally done what no one quite believed they could. They've taken the holy city. But here's the thing. Capturing a city is one thing. Holding it is another. And soon the Crusaders realized they hadn't just conquered a patch of stone and sand. They had to invent a whole new political system. So tonight we're going to drift gently through the strange, fragile world that followed. The birth of the Crusader states, Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. Each one a tiny European transplant, perched awkwardly in the Middle East. Like little medieval startups, running mostly on stubbornness, improvised rulebooks, and the occasional divine justification. Godfrey's delicate balancing act. We'll begin with Jerusalem. After the siege, the Crusaders had to choose a ruler. Naturally, the obvious candidate was Godfrey of Bouillon. A tall, pious knight from the region of Lorraine. Chroniclers describe him as dignified and devout, though one suspects that after 3 years in the desert, he probably looked more like a scarecrow that had been left out in the rain. Now, Godfrey was offered the crown of Jerusalem. But he refused the title of king. He thought it would be improper to call himself king in the very city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. So instead, he styled himself Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender, or advocate, of the Holy Sepulchre. Which sounded pious, but of course still meant, yes, I'm in charge, please bring me the nice chair. His rule was short-lived, less than a year, but it set the tone. The new kingdom of Jerusalem was not a casual colony. It was meant to be a holy experiment, a European Christian state planted directly in the heart of the Levant. The Crusader states emerge. Now, Jerusalem was the jewel. But it wasn't the only Crusader project in town. In fact, even before Jerusalem fell, several little states had already started sprouting. The first was the county of Edessa, founded in 1098 by Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's ambitious younger brother. Baldwin had originally been heading toward Jerusalem like everyone else, but then he spotted an opportunity. Edessa, a city in modern-day Turkey, was wealthy, vulnerable, and lacking strong leadership. Baldwin charmed the local Armenian ruler, married into his family, and then, very politely, took over. Suddenly, Baldwin was a count. He had his own state. And when Godfrey died the following year, Baldwin moved south and upgraded to King of Jerusalem. So, a classic medieval career path: start as a younger son with no inheritance, seize a city by marriage, and eventually crown yourself in a holy city. Not bad. Meanwhile, over on the coast, there was Antioch. This had been captured in 1098 after a famously grueling siege. The Crusaders nearly starved, then nearly gave up, then supposedly found a holy relic, the Holy Lance, which encouraged them enough to finally win. And who got Antioch? Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer who looked at the city and said, "Yes, this will do nicely." He kept it for himself, despite everyone else's protests. Antioch became a principality, ruled by Bohemond's descendants. And finally, a little further down the Mediterranean coast, we find Tripoli. This one took a bit longer. Raymond of Toulouse, who had missed out on Jerusalem, decided he deserved a coastal city of his own. He besieged Tripoli for years, literally building a fortress nearby to keep an eye on it, until finally, in 1109, the city fell. Thus the county of Tripoli was born. By 1109, then, the map looked very different. For Crusader states dotted the region: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. Each was tiny. Each was vulnerable. and yet each became a peculiar experiment in ruling far from home. Everyday rule in the Crusader states. Let's pause here, because it's easy to think of these states as glamorous. Shining knights, holy processions, exotic palaces. In reality, life was much more ordinary. For one, most crusaders who captured Jerusalem didn't stay. Many packed up and went home, eager to boast about their pilgrimage and maybe exaggerate their heroics at local taverns. That left behind only a small group, perhaps a few thousand, to run the place. So what did that mean? It meant the Crusaders had to rely on locals. Syrian Christians, Armenians, even some Muslims remained in the cities and countryside, farming, trading, and providing the basic skills the newcomers lacked. Crusader lords perched at the top, but underneath them, the social fabric stayed surprisingly mixed. It also meant that European customs were awkwardly transplanted into a hot, dry climate. Castles were built, but they had to be adapted to the landscape. Laws were drawn up, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in French, sometimes in Greek or Arabic. Markets bustled with goods far more exotic than anything in northern France: spices, silk, citrus. Imagine a Norman knight from damp Normandy biting into his first orange. One suspect's confusion, followed by delight, followed by sticky chainmail. Fragility and paranoia. Of course, fragility was built into the system. These states were small. Their rulers were few. They depended on reinforcements and supplies from Europe, which could take months or years to arrive. And surrounding them were powerful Muslim neighbors, the Fatimids in Egypt, the Seljuks in Syria, and countless smaller emirates. This bred a constant atmosphere of paranoia. Fortresses were constructed along every road. Messengers hurried between castles with news of raids. Knights rode patrols in the heat, scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might signal an approaching army. And yet, for all their vulnerability, the Crusader states endured for nearly 2 centuries. Partly because of their fortifications, partly because of divisions among their enemies, and partly because, somehow, people simply carried on. The irony of it all. Here's the irony. The Crusaders had come to the Holy Land with lofty ideals, to liberate Jerusalem, to walk where Christ had walked. And they had done it. But within a few short years, those ideals were buried under the practicalities of feudal politics. Who gets which castle? Who marries which heiress? Who controls the port that brings in Italian merchants and their ever-so-useful ships? In the end, the Crusader states looked less like a holy mission and more like Europe in miniature. A patchwork of quarreling nobles, bound by oaths, occasionally united by religion, and always planning the next siege. A sleepy drift. So let's imagine this world at twilight. A narrow castle rising over a dry valley. A French knight leaning on the battlements, staring out over olive groves. Below him, farmers tending fields as they have for centuries, indifferent to the fact that their landlord now speaks Norman French. The smell of spice drifting in from the marketplace. The faint sound of prayers, some in Latin, some in Greek, some in Arabic, rising from different corners of the town. This was the reality of the Crusader states. Fragile, improvised, yet strangely enduring. Not quite Europe, not quite the Middle East, but something in between. A frontier world, carved out of dust and stubbornness. And with that, let's let the sun set over those makeshift kingdoms. Their rulers squabbling in smoky halls. Their castles baking in the desert heat. And their people, crusaders, locals, pilgrims, going about their lives under a sky that must have seemed impossibly vast. Because history isn't only made in the moments of conquest. It's in the long, uncertain days afterward. The strange experiment of trying to live in a world you've only just taken.